May 12, 1943, North Atlantic. A German U-boat has just attacked an Allied convoy and disappeared beneath the surface. For a submarine captain, this is the moment when the ocean becomes a fortress. No aircraft can see him, no gun can reach him, and the weapon normally used against him has one enormous weakness: it has to know where he is going. The submarine dives. The aircraft circles the empty patch of ocean. Then something strange happens. A small American weapon falls from the sky. It enters the water, and instead of racing toward the place where the submarine was, it begins to search. Because this weapon isn't looking for the U-boat, it's listening for it. And the Germans don't even know that such a weapon exists. The Americans have deliberately given it a harmless name, Mark 24 mine. But it isn't a mine. It's something far more dangerous. It's a torpedo that can hear, and what happened next would help turn May 1943 into the month the U-boat war began to collapse. But before we get to that, we need to understand why hitting a submerged submarine was such a nightmare in the first place. Imagine throwing a grenade at someone running through a forest while you're blindfolded. That's essentially the problem Allied aircraft faced. A U-boat could dive, change direction, slow its engines, and disappear beneath hundreds of feet of water. The aircraft might know approximately where the submarine had gone, but approximately wasn't good enough. A conventional depth charge didn't think. It didn't search. It didn't chase. It simply sank through the water and exploded at a predetermined depth. So if the submarine turned, the weapon was already chasing yesterday's position, and the U-boat captain knew this. He didn't have to outrun the weapon. He only had to turn away from it. That created a brutal mathematical problem. The moment the submarine disappeared beneath the surface, the attacker was effectively fighting a moving target with an outdated location. And there was another problem. A torpedo couldn't solve it either. Traditional torpedoes followed predetermined courses. Once launched, they were committed. No brain, no correction, no second chance. Then American researchers began asking a question that sounded almost absurd. What if the torpedo could hear the submarine? Not see it, not be guided by radio, not be controlled from the aircraft? What if the weapon could simply detect the submarine's propellers and turn toward the sound? That question would lead to one of the most important anti-submarine weapons of the war. But the first people who tried to build it discovered something terrifying. The weapon could hear, but it could also hear itself. The breakthrough came from an unusual partnership. This wasn't simply a torpedo project. It brought together physicists, engineers, acoustic specialists, and researchers from organizations including Bell Telephone Laboratories and Western Electric. Their expertise wasn't killing submarines. It was something much stranger, making machines understand sound. The basic idea was elegant. A submarine's propellers produce noise. Put hydrophones around the front of a torpedo. Listen to the underwater sound. Compare what each sensor hears. Then determine which direction contains the strongest signal. The steering system could make small corrections. Left, right, left again, until the weapon was moving toward the source. It was primitive by modern standards, but in 1942, it was revolutionary. For the first time, an American underwater weapon could make a decision after it had been launched. But there was a problem. The torpedo's own motor was screaming into the water. The hydrophones were trying to hear a German submarine while sitting inside another machine making noise. It was like trying to hear a whisper while standing beside an aircraft engine. The project nearly died. Then engineers tried something deceptively simple. They isolated the listening equipment from the torpedo's own vibration. Suddenly, the weapon could begin to distinguish target noise from its own. The concept survived, But now came the most dangerous question. Would it actually work against a real submarine? The weapon was eventually tested against simulated submarine targets. The engineers weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for one thing. Could the machine find a moving submarine without anyone steering it? Because if it couldn't, the entire idea was worthless. The Mark 24 was deliberately designed as a small, air-dropped anti-submarine weapon. It was only about 7 feet long. It weighed roughly 680 pounds. And inside that compact body was something the Germans had not yet learned how to defend against: a passive acoustic homing system. Once in the water, the weapon could conduct a preset search. If it detected the right acoustic signal, its hydrophones took over. The torpedo then steered toward the sound. No wire connected it to the aircraft. No operator sat somewhere guiding it. The weapon was alone, listening, searching, waiting for the submarine to make a mistake. And the submarine had one huge advantage. The ocean was enormous. If the U-boat went quiet enough, the weapon might never find it. That was the weakness. Fido wasn't magic. It was relatively slow. It had a limited search time. And it depended on the submarine producing enough noise for the hydrophones to detect. But that weakness created an even more terrifying possibility. Because a submarine captain could reduce his engines, but he couldn't make the ocean completely silent. And he couldn't turn off his propellers forever. Then came May 1943. The Atlantic had become a killing ground. Allied aircraft were improving. Radar was improving. Convoy tactics were improving. And now the Allies had something else, a weapon the Germans didn't fully understand. On May 12, an RAF Coastal Command Liberator encountered U-456 during the Battle of the Atlantic. The submarine had been detected. The aircraft attacked, and the crew released the new weapon. The Mark 24 entered the water. For the first time in combat, the secret weapon was hunting on its own. Somewhere below the surface, the German submarine was trying to survive. The Fido began its search. Then its hydrophones detected the sound of the submarine, and the weapon turned. This was the moment the old rules changed. The U-boat could no longer assume that turning away from the predicted attack path would be enough. The weapon wasn't following the position where the submarine had been. It was responding to where the submarine was moving. The Mark 24 struck U-456 and badly damaged it. The submarine later sank, and suddenly the secret American weapon had its first combat success. But the Germans still didn't understand what had happened. And that was the most dangerous part, because they were about to encounter it again and again. 2 days later, another Mark 24 attack helped destroy U-640. Now the weapon had demonstrated something that conventional depth charges struggled to accomplish. It could attack a submarine that was already underwater and still moving. Over the following months, more Fidos entered combat, and the weapon began accumulating an extraordinary record. Post-war U.S. Navy analysis credited Mark 24 attacks with sinking 37 enemy submarines and damaging 18 more. That did not mean Fido won the Battle of the Atlantic by itself. It didn't. May 1943 was a convergence of several Allied advantages: better radar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, improved intelligence, better convoy tactics, and increasingly effective anti-submarine weapons. But Fido attacked one of the U-boat's most important advantages: evasion. And that matters, because a submarine's greatest weapon isn't its torpedoes, it's its ability to disappear. Once submerged, a U-boat captain traditionally relied on uncertainty. Where is the destroyer? Where is the aircraft? Where will the depth charges land? Which direction should I turn? Fido changed the question. Now the submarine captain had to wonder, what if the weapon already knows where I'm turning? And then came the month that would become infamous inside the German U-boat command. May 1943. The Germans had entered the month expecting the Atlantic campaign to continue. Instead, the losses became catastrophic. 41 U-boats were lost during the month. The causes were numerous: Allied radar, aircraft, escort carriers, code breaking, improved tactics, better coordination, and new weapons like Fido. On May 24, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered his U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy battle. The submarine offensive had become too expensive. The Allies had changed the equation, and somewhere inside that equation was a weapon that many German commanders still didn't fully understand, because the Americans had hidden its true identity behind one deliberately misleading word: mine. Imagine being a German submarine commander in 1943. You dive after an aircraft attack. You shut down as much as you can. You turn away. You wait for the depth charges, but instead of explosives blindly falling through the water, something begins searching. It doesn't need radar. It doesn't need a human operator. It doesn't need to know your exact position beforehand. It only needs to hear you. And that's the terrifying brilliance of Fido. It didn't make the ocean smaller. It made silence less reliable. But there was one final twist. Fido wasn't unbeatable. Its speed was only about 12 knots. That meant a surfaced submarine could potentially outrun it. Its search duration was limited. Its acoustic system depended on detecting the target. And if the submarine went sufficiently quiet or deep, the weapon's chances could fall dramatically. So why was it still revolutionary? Because the Allies didn't need a perfect weapon. They needed a weapon that could turn a submarine's movement against it. The U-boat had spent years learning how to survive by maneuvering. Now maneuvering could reveal it. Every turn changed the acoustic picture. Every propeller rotation produced information. Every second the submarine kept moving, it gave the weapon something to follow. That is the real genius of Fido. It didn't simply explode near submarines. It hunted their mistakes. By the end of the war, thousands of Mark 24 units had been produced, although only a fraction were actually used in combat. And the weapon's influence went far beyond its wartime numbers, because the idea had been proven. An underwater weapon could listen, it could recognize a target's sound, and it could alter its own course accordingly. That concept would shape generations of acoustic homing torpedoes that followed. The technology that once sounded like science fiction had become standard naval warfare, and perhaps the strangest part of the entire story is how quietly it happened. There was no giant new battleship, no enormous gun, no spectacular aircraft, just a small weapon dropped into a dark ocean, carrying 4 hydrophones, a steering system, and enough intelligence to make one terrifying decision: follow the sound. The Germans thought the ocean was hiding their submarines. The Americans discovered that the ocean was also giving them away. And for a few critical months in 1943, the deadliest place in the Atlantic wasn't where the U-boat was seen. It was where the U-boat thought nobody could hear it. And that was the moment the hunter finally learned how to listen.